Welcome to Answers News, Monday, April 24th, 2023.
Hello, I'm Avery Foley, and I'm here with Brian Osborne and Dr. Jennifer Rivera. And today we'll be discussing the United Nations seemingly attempting to normalize pedophilia, in addition to some other news stories. Let's start with this first one. New UN-backed legal recommendations normalize sex with minors, outraged critics say. And if you think that that is maybe a bit of a hyperbole or, a bit of a salacious title to try and get clicks, you'd be wrong.
I wish it was.
I wish we could say that it was, but unfortunately, nope, that is accurate to the guidance that was released by an international group of jurists that was commissioned by and with the full backing of the United Nations. This document, this guidance, gets into a whole host of different things, including abortion, sex work, prostitution, what we would normally call it, sex with minors, all kinds of different things. And let's just say it's not biblical in how it approaches any of these things.
So it essentially states, this new guidance states that children have both the capacity and the legal right to make sexual decisions. And so think about this. For most people in most cultures around the world, children don't have the right to choose when they go to bed, whether or not to brush their teeth, whether or not to go to school, whether or not to get a tattoo or drink alcohol, depending on where you're at. But yet they can choose somehow to have sex with adults.
And I think what's really disturbing is there's absolutely no age guidelines
not at
mentioned
all.
It's not like they're saying 16 to 18 or it's like pretty much any child under the age of 18 should be able to give consent.
They say sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent to sex may be consensual in fact, if not in law. So, and then they go on to talk about how under 18 years of age, and that's literally the only thing they say is just under 18. And this follows naturally from the ethic of our culture. The ethic of our culture today is that the only thing that matters is consent. That is the absolute only moral right or wrong when it comes to any kind of activity is consent. And if that is your ethic, and if you're going to say, well, children can consent to having puberty blockers and to having these surgeries that'll alter their lives forever, and if they can decide what gender they are, well, then of course you take that further, and children can decide whether or not they want to have sexual relations with someone, regardless of the age of that someone. And as long as they consent to it, it's totally fine under our modern sexual ethic. It's a natural consequence of that. But of course, naturally, every person in the audience, your faces look horrified, as they should, because it naturally goes against what we know about the innocence of children and how children deserve to be protected and loved and cared for, not exploited by people who would use them in a disgusting, horrible way that God never, ever intended. We naturally feel that revulsion because we should, because that's not what children are designed for.
And if you've been kind of wondering, you kind of look around at our culture, think, man, why such the rapid push on all these transgender ideologies and these so-called sex change operations? Why this push on a culture to make this normalized? Well, I think this helps answer that particular question, because it does want to hypersexualize kids, hypersexualize our culture, because ultimately you understand this is a spiritual battle. What does the enemy want to do? Steal, kill, and destroy. And so if you can break down all the sexual norms, all those biblical parameters for sexuality, for marriage, for gender, break all that down, you break down the whole apparatus God has put in place for society to flourish and for humans to flourish. And so he's doing that to attack those things, to see death and destruction. That's his goal. That's what he loves to do. We're seeing the fruit of that in so many different ways.
And so much of this is related to all this drag queen shows that we see out there, the grooming of children. They're trying to desensitize them, and just make them more, I would say, complicit, right, in these activities. So when they are approached by people, they're less likely to say no or maybe go tell their parents because they've seen so much of it. It seems normal, right? Yeah. Everyone's doing it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just such attack, as we've been talking about, on parental authority as well. And if a child does stand up to it, or a parent does try to say, no, I don't want my child going to this drag queen show. No, I don't want you teaching this in public school.
No,
what
you're the
happens
bad
is,
parent.
oh yeah, you're the bad parent. You're the one who needs to be taken away from these kids because you're restricting, what they're being exposed to.
And of course, like we said, the only rule they have here is consent. So they don't want a child, of course, to be coerced or manipulated or whatever into this. But A, how do you define that? Who defines that? Who defines what that is? And B, children are very easily coerced and manipulated into things without them realizing they're being coerced and manipulated. That's why parents have to work so hard to protect them, because they're very vulnerable. They're one of the most vulnerable classes of people because they're so easily, they don't have a full understanding. They're not mini adults who understand the world fully. and can make full informed decisions. They're children, their brains are not fully developed, and so we protect them as adults. We don't say, oh, it's up to you, you decide, do whatever you want, you can make these choices that'll change you for the rest of your life, whatever. We protect them. And so yes, adults can come along and manipulate and coerce a child in a way that doesn't even appear to be manipulative or coercive to the child. So that's an absolutely ridiculous thing to put in there, because it's really meaningless, and who gets to decide what that means anyway?
Well, not only how do you define consent, that's one issue, but here's my other question. Why is consent the standard? Where are they getting that from? Because once you abandon God's word as the authority, what are you left with? Man's arbitrary opinions as your authority.
That are always changing.
Why should consent be the rule of thumb? Why can't something else? If I want to oppress someone and do something against your will, why can't I do that? Why not if I determine what is right and wrong for myself? Their standard is totally arbitrary without that biblical foundation. And it's interesting as you look at this, it says those who decided on this new guidance, the people were expert jurists, academics, legal practitioners, human rights defenders.
Human rights.
Yeah. All right. Various civil society organizations working in diverse legal traditions. Not one person from a religious background, not one Christian mentioned, not one other religious ideology. You got to wonder why that is.
And if you read through the whole guidance here, that's just one of the things they touch on. Throughout the guidance, they talk about abortion, of course. Not surprisingly, they want any prohibitions to abortion whatsoever completely lifted, that no one in any way, shape, or form, no matter what happens, should ever be held culpable for the murder of an unborn child. They go on to talk about sex work, that it should be, not only should it be completely decriminalized, but anyone who would basically the third parties, what we would typically call like pimps or whatever, that should be completely decriminalized as well, so that people are able to buy and sell and trade in that industry. And as you read through this and you see all these different things that they're pushing for the decriminalization of around the world, what you really see is the most vulnerable people, women and children, particularly poor women and children, are the ones who are being exploited, really so that rich, powerful men can get what they want. That's really what it comes down to. These people have no regard for the life of others, and they claim it's all because of human rights and everybody should be allowed to do what they want with their body. No, it's really so that rich men can do what they want with other people's bodies, is really what it comes down to. And it's disgusting and it's depraved, but it's the natural consequence of the lack of a biblical worldview. If you look back at the culture before Christianity burst onto the scene, this stuff was normal. It was Christianity that came in and said, no, people are made in the image of God. Children have value. We're going to rescue the children who've just been left out to die in the elements. We're going to rescue them. We're going to build orphanages. We're going to build things to take care of people, to heal the sick, to educate people. It's Christians that have been on the forefront of doing that, because we have a different foundation. And we understand that every person is made in the image of God, and they have value, and their value isn't tied to their body and what they do or don't do with their body. It's tied to Jesus Christ and what he did with his body by dying on the cross to pay the penalty that we deserve because of our sin. That's where our value and our worth comes from, being made in God's image and the value that God gives us, not what the UN supposedly believes about human rights.
And it is a natural consequence of the evolutionary worldview, ultimately, because if you just rearrange pond scum, you're just a highly evolved animal, no different than a rat or a mouse or an octopus or a fern. So why not utilize and abuse things if you want to?
Yeah.
Ideas have consequences, and as you rightly said, bad ideas have victims.
Yes, yeah. Speaking of victims, the next one comes from Insider. Parents in the Netherlands can now agree to euthanize their terminally ill children under the age of 12 to end, quote unquote, unbearable suffering. So the Netherlands has had euthanasia legal since 2002. And when it comes to these euthanasia laws, euthanasia is like assisted suicide, that kind of thing. We've always said, Christians have always said, ethicists have always said, this is a slippery slope. You will start out here, and it will not take very long before you end up here. And of course, everybody always says, oh, slippery slope arguments. Oh. Well, it's exactly what's happened. They started out with, okay, those who have a terminal illness, who are over this age, they can choose to end their own lives. And now, 20 years later, children can now choose to, of course, they say now with parental permission, but who knows how long that'll last. Children can now choose to end their own life if they have hopeless and unbearable suffering. And again, who defines what that is?
Right. Well, what does that even mean? Right. Unbearable? I mean, I would say so many different people have different levels of pain tolerance, and a lot of it has to do with your support network at home and how many loved ones do you have around you encouraging you to make it through, and how many people thought they were dying of a terminal illness, and come to find out some new treatment comes out or something that prolongs their life for 5 years. Well, those 5 years are valuable. 5 more years with those people that love you. 5 more years that the Creator who made you wants you on this earth, because who are we to determine when it's time for someone's life to end, right? God is the author of creation, and he knits us together, and he decides when it's time.
All the days
right.
ordained for us are written in his
Yep.
book.
And if you purposely take someone's life, even if you think it's with a good intention or motive, the Bible still calls that murder. Even if you take in your own life, well, that life is not your own. It's given to you by your Creator. If you try to take your own life or do take your own life, that's still murder in the eyes of God, even with the best of intentions, because God is the author of life, and he decides our last days. They're in his hands. He's numbered our days. And so that's his prerogative as creator and as judge. And we talked a little bit backstage about this. And it's interesting, as you mentioned, Avery, this slippery slope, because oftentimes with euthanasia, you'll see the transition of thought from people have a right to die to people have a duty to die. Because at some point, if you are too much of a burden on the system you live in,
Too expensive.
right?
If they're paying for your health care, as we said,
Well,
you can become too expensive to care for.
And so let's
right?
just get you out of the way so we can give all these good resources to those who are more healthy and can contribute back into the society. And so you see that develop as well. And then also, as Avery mentioned, right now they still involve parents. Now, how long before they say, parents, you're not needed, or maybe you're even a hindrance? Or what did you say backstage about that, as far as like the government could take away the resources or the funding?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right?
The government, if they're paying for all this, then they can certainly take away whatever they want to and deem that you're no longer of value.
That's
and
right.
then,
Parents are out of the equation.
Right, you're out of the equation, because we can see parental rights are definitely under attack in the United States as well as the rest of the world. And they just keep chipping at it and chipping at it and chipping at it, because fundamentally they want control of your children. Pretty
And
much
parents
from
are the
cradle to
biggest
grave.
barriers to having control
Right.
over your children. Parents are the ones that keep them safe. Parents are the ones that protect them. So get rid of parents, you can do whatever you want. It's interesting, in the article they mentioned that this will affect up to 10 children each year, is what they're saying. I 100% guarantee you that it will not be, it will not
is a lot
stay
more than
10
10.
children
Is that a
per year.
money-back guarantee?
Yeah,
I don't believe it for a second. It's the devaluing of human life.
It's just going to continue. It's already 4.5% of total deaths in the Netherlands were from people choosing euthanasia. 4.5% of total deaths in 2021. So that's only going to continue to increase.
And by the way, who defines what is unbearable suffering, right? Because, for example, we know that men and women have very different pain tolerances. The joke goes, women have a much higher pain tolerance, right? But I mean, in reality, who defines, is it merely mental struggle? Right? If you are feeling
Right. What if it's not
depressed,
physical, but you just have mental issues, right? You're just like, I can't deal with
It's
my life
unbearable,
anymore. It's
right?
unbearable. Okay.
And how many of us as a teenager have felt like things have been unbearable, at least just for a little bit, right? Because teenage years are crazy to one degree or another. And so how you define that can also have consequences in how this plays out in society.
The next one comes from the Federalist. Oregon's ban on Christians adopting violates the First Amendment and good sense. So this is talking about a really sad case out of the state of Oregon, where a woman named Jessica Bates, who is a widow who has 5 children, she's a part-time ultrasound tech, a Christian, and she wanted to, she felt pulled towards adoption and helping some of these children who are languishing in the foster care system. And so she went to the state, the Department of Human Services, and applied to be a foster parent, to be an adoptive parent. And according to this article, the state put her through an ideological litmus test and basically asked her, what do you think about LGBTQ issues? What do you think about children with who are LGBTQ, identify on the spectrum? And she said she would love them, but she wouldn't. She's not going to support a gender transition or a homosexual relationship.
Needs to go
like
against her
that.
Christian faith.
Yeah, and you can imagine what the state of Oregon said. They said, sorry, you're not eligible to be able to adopt because you don't basically meet the litmus test of what we require. So now the Alliance Defending Freedom is taking them to court because this is in violation of the First Amendment, her free speech, her ability to live out her faith. But it's really sad because this is the way the culture is heading.
Oh my goodness.
Where people like us are considered to be unfit parents because we won't abide by these ideologies of our culture that are hurting children. But
yeah, they specified like 3 specific things that caregivers had to do. They had to call them by their preferred pronouns. You didn't have a choice not to. You had to agree to take the children to LGBTQ events and pride parades, and you had to agree to take the children to receive their hormone shots if they decided they, wanted to transition into another gender. I mean, it's just so hard to even, I truly believe that she's going to win this case. I just don't see how the state of Oregon can win. But can you imagine if the state of Oregon does win? The repercussions of that on every other Christian in any other state who may feel that burden to adopt. And as we were saying, Brian, you've adopted 2 children.
That's right.
So what would have happened to you?
I wouldn't be a parent.
Right, you wouldn't even be a parent now.
This hits on multiple levels for all of us, me as I think through this. But I mean, please note what they're saying. They're basically saying if you're going to be a good parent, then you'll do all these things. So if you don't do these things, guess what that makes you? A bad parent.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if you're a bad parent, according from their perspective, your child is unsafe. It makes you wonder how long before they come to other parents and say, you're not doing these things, you're not fit to be a parent, your child is unsafe. We need to put them somewhere else where they are safe to express
seen
themselves.
And we've
in
already
different
talked
ways.
about that on other Andrews News in the United States where, parents have said, no, I do not want my child transitioning. And they've said, well, you're unfit. We need to take that child away from you.
I mean,
and that's biological parents.
And think about this. That means that a drag queen, a grown man who dresses provocatively like a woman and who dances provocatively in front of children for his kicks and giggles, he is seen as a fit parent, whereas this woman who holds to Christian beliefs, to a Christian view of sexuality and gender that's been the norm in societies for thousands of years, she's seen as unfit. How backwards is that? It's calling what is evil good and good evil.
Mm-hmm.
I do like how this article kind of did go into the history of how Christians are really the ones who, we've always been the ones, as Avery talked about earlier, being the ones to take those orphans in, and and it just is a good reminder as well that God is the father to the fatherless, and so and it just kind of reminds me that if you don't know Christ as your Savior, you're really an orphan yourself. You're an orphan in this world because if you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, then you don't have a father to call God, right? You don't have that promise that the Bible describes. So I think it just reminded me as well that how thankful I am that I'm no longer an orphan in this world, that I do have a Heavenly Father, and we can just pray for these children that, that the law is going to be on their side and that they're going to allow, who would you rather kids be with? Christians? Or, like you said, a drag queen, porn star type individual. It's just tragic.